This podcast is Challenging Opinions and is presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading the Challenging Opinions podcast for August 5th, 2019. I'm wary of debating anti-vaxxers for a whole bunch of reasons, but in this show I'm talking to someone who isn't necessarily an anti-vaxxer, but thinks we shouldn't dismiss them out of hand. See what you think.
Challenging Opinions is the podcast where ideas are tested. Whether you are left or right, conservative or progressive, devout or skeptic. What matters is the strength of your argument, not the strength of your voice.
Here's what we've got coming up for you in this podcast.
I don't know if I said in the article that it is censorship. I think at one point I raised the question that if the article I wrote,
let me put it further. They're under a moral duty not to allow their systems be used to propagate information which is untrue and harmful.
The question of what is or isn't true is never finally determined.
That's coming up in a minute. In fact, it's coming up almost right now because this is quite a long interview. I think it was worth keeping it all in. I didn't want to edit anything out. So I'm dropping the editorial at the start of the podcast so as not to take up too much of your time. On a Skype line now, I have Gautam Tejas Ganeshan. He's a musician and a blogger from the US, and I was reading one of the blog posts that you wrote for Medium.com, Gautam, about anti-vaxxers, and the title of the article was, "Is there an intelligible anti-vax position?" And I suppose my first question for you is there?
I think that there is. The answer to the question posed by the title of the article is the article. And so, of course, I'd say right off the bat that I would encourage folks to read it as an accessory to the conversation we're about to have.
Mm-hmm. I'll link to it in the show notes.
All right. Great. Yes, I think there is. I think, in writing it, I was attempting to do a number of things. One of them is to demonstrate that it's almost as if in the public conversation about this, it's as if there is a presumption fairly widely shared and fairly widely expressed that on the other side of the conversation, the position of the anti-vaxxers, that it's mostly or all error, anti-science, people who are being duped by demagogues, people who are misinformed, and that is a total summary of what's there on that side. And I don't see it that way, and I saw myself as capable of articulating the position. And in so doing, I don't see myself as an advocate, except in as much as I want higher quality conversation, and I don't want recriminations and accusations in place of considering the views of other people, because there's always value to be had in taking something seriously and seeing what in it is, can help one's own view, even if you don't ultimately agree. So that's some of what my motivation was in doing what I did.
Okay, well, I tend to agree with you insofar as you're saying that it's always a good idea to coolly look at points of view, particularly ones that you don't hold yourself, and to see, is there reason or is there anything sensible that can be got out of that? But I would make the point, obviously you studied philosophy and you're not a medical doctor and neither am I. And I think that sometimes people who are in the liberal arts have a training in seeing both sides of an argument and saying on the one hand this and on the other hand that, and they miss out a feature that exists in the sciences, which is that the sun rises in the east. And if somebody else comes along and says, well, in my opinion, it rises in the north or the west, they're just flat wrong. And there are issues that exist whereby there's just no debating. That is true, isn't it?
There's definitely such a thing as being wrong. I think that that's true. I would say that there are different domains of discourse, and the ability of a fact in a certain domain to have a truth value that's completely determinable varies, so that it's more true in some arenas of investigation that interpretation plays a large role in determining whether something's true or not. And in other arenas of investigation, interpretation is less relevant. And as you say, the sun
I
rises on the east.
agree. I absolutely agree. And by the way, I should also say that perhaps people who are more grounded in the science field sometimes have a blind spot and want to have a black and white answer in domains, as you put it, where such things don't exist and shades of meaning are important. But Gautam, medicine is a science. And for as long as medicine has been a science, human lifespans have increased in leaps and bounds, and the amount of well-being, the amount of good health during that lifespan has increased dramatically. And isn't it a little bit impertinent of someone who's coming from the humanities, from the liberal arts, to cross over and to say, well, maybe on the one hand, maybe on the other? It's just not true. In the last couple of centuries, our lifespans have doubled.
I'm going to try and do as good of a job as I can of tracking the various threads here. So the first thing I want to say in response to that is you say that medicine is a science, full stop. I would push back on that. I would say that medicine is a practice aimed at human health, for which science is a very apt, very powerful, very useful set of tools for arriving at a certain type of truth that's relevant to the project of improving human health. But the practice of medicine involves other things and requires decisions, for instance, by its practitioners, which cannot be adjudicated definitively by scientific question, by the answer to scientific questions. What should we do in situation X is not given an answer by what are all the facts in situation X.
Pause on that, Gautam, pause on that for a second. Yes, you're correct. Science can never tell you what should you do. But having decided on your goal, science most certainly can tell you how to achieve it.
I understand the thrust of that comment, and I agree with the thrust. I wonder whether we should continue on that thread now for me to follow up.
Sure do, yes.
You think so?
Absolutely. Shoot.
Okay. All right. So it might be presumed that so we've differentiated within medicine the goal from the technique. And, and the technique is the thing that science can definitively say, well, suppose you want to do X, this is how you do it, and we know the best practices, that's that. Subject to, of course, the best practices themselves being improved in their own domain. But I am not sure that I would assert that the goal of medicine is a self-evident, simply statable thing.
Absolutely.
And that's one of the things that I bring up in the article. For instance, it might be, one might say, it's simply true and impossible to argue with that what we should do is reduce human suffering. And I would never make a big show of countering that, because in the broad strokes, I agree. I definitely think we should do that. But to think that that suffices as a way to adjudicate every ethical dilemma is, I think, to be a bit short-sighted and to leave out some tools that we might need to decide some difficult questions. For example, as I point out in the article, what about the simple phrase, no pain, no gain? that presents another way of seeing life as a whole, where optimizing for the minimization of suffering is not complete. You also need to take into account long-term goals, and if a small degree of suffering in the short term is valuable in terms of the long term, then it's an acceptable cost. And the point of me saying that is simply to note that what the goals are subject to their own debate, and it's not just a matter of being an axiom that, okay, this is what we're trying to do, and all we need to do is figure out how best to do it. Also, there's also the question of, are we sure what we're trying to do and whatnot? So that's that.
Sure, and let me pause you on that for a second, because of course the goals are a far more difficult thing to decide in moral terms. But I think that that maybe you're suffering from a bit of the Dunning-Kruger effect when you say that doctors, for example, don't take this into account. Doctors take this into account all the time. Doctors make decisions as to, for example, a dying cancer patient, how much opiates they should give them, and regularly give them enough to kill them, with the dual effect of eliminating pain. But sometimes don't, because they, for example, might be aware that a family member to whom both the dying person and the family member, it's very important that they see them before they die, is arriving but hasn't quite arrived. Doctors make very difficult decisions like that all the time. Are you maybe just not being well enough informed on that?
I would definitely not aim to impugn the compassion of doctors writ large, or of the medical profession as an establishment at all. Mm-hmm. I agree with you that the practice of medicine requires difficult decisions, and doctors, generally speaking, are address themselves to it with all of their tools, not only the tools that come from medical training, but also their humanity and their ethical positions. And they do have to make often trade-offs, as you say. One thing I would flag as a consequence of you bringing up that way of considering this topic is that is a case or a few cases of individuals using individual knowledge to fulfill individual purposes, which would be less able to be determined by a decision by remote control or by a bureaucratic intervention or conformity to a best practices from afar. And I would just note that the ethos there is something which is at odds with a pronouncement as a matter of society-wide policy about what would be a universally applicable best practices medical injunction. Mm-hmm. And so it's interesting to consider that what you're speaking up for is that there is a role for decision-making on the level of the individual case.
Sure, of course. And that's what doctors do all the time. And you mentioned, and I think I have to say it's a little bit trite, you said no pain, no gain. Isn't it true that doctors every day of the week, for example, maybe cancer doctors who are advising a patient who might be getting chemotherapy or radiotherapy, saying that in your case, this is going to be very difficult treatment to take, but it will give you X chance of living Y more years. And in your case, that's probably worth it, but you can make that decision yourself. And in some cases, they will guide a patient towards saying that you will suffer a lot in order to get a very short amount of poor quality extra life, and say that, may not be what you want. Doctors make very sophisticated decisions like that all the time. And of course, they're not perfect and may have improper motives as well. But to say something like no pain, no gain, that's very unsophisticated, isn't it?
Well, as I've already said, I don't take anything that I believe in general or that I articulated in the article in question to be an indictment of individual doctors making decisions. I think it's a difficult thing, and I the case you describe here happens all the time, of course. And I am not saying, in saying no pain, no gain, that is The purpose, obviously, that is a short, pithy saying that cannot be taken to be a generalizable philosophy of life.
Well, in medicine, it's mostly wrong because pain is an evolutionary signal to stop doing what you're doing.
And yet, there are critiques of medicine that think that the administration of painkillers are overdone, and those critiques can be taken seriously as a corrective to certain excesses in medicine. And so all I'm doing in saying that is I'm complicating the presumption that the reduction of suffering, full stop, is the goal of medical intervention. I'm not saying that the alternative is the way it is instead. I'm just saying that neither one of those can be taken to be the conclusion of our thinking about what the aims of medicine are. So you use the word trite. Sure, in itself, that statement is a kind of a, it's what you might find a gym rat saying to justify their, routine with the barbells. Sure, yeah. But I think someone who encounters the way that I use that in the article would know that would agree with me that I'm not doing it as in order to make a self-evident point, but rather as one more way of thinking adduced to complicate a general outlook.
Okay. Pause with that for a second, because we're getting a little bit off track. But I want to go to a couple of things that you said in the article. One of which was about essentially the autonomy of parents, and you talk, and this is a relatively well-worn argument, I'm sure the listeners are well familiar with it, but one thing that you left out is that it's generally not parents who are the people getting immunized, it's their children. And sure, there are some people, there are a variety of motives within anti-vaxxers. But within that, there is certainly a very strong strain of people who are essentially narcissistically believing that they have access to greater information or have a better power of understanding, and they're then making their children into the unwilling standard bearers of their movement and literally putting their lives at risk. That's not something that a parent is morally entitled to do, is it?
This is a very relevant subtopic on this, and I think I think the hackles that get raised by people as a consequence of considering this element of the phenomenon of the anti-vax position, I think I recognize the moral force behind it. So I do address many of the things that you're bringing up directly in the paper. The first thing I'll do to respond is just state some of those. One is that parents are not their children. That's true. But parenting involves all kinds of decisions on behalf of children that set children up in one way or another for their lives.
Sure, absolutely. And within that, parents normally have an enormous degree of variability that they can choose from. They have discretion in a huge amount of cases, in almost always. But once in a while, the state takes the view that it is entitled to intervene if the behavior of the parent is so egregious that it is clearly harming the child, or if it's harmful to someone else in society. And refusal of vaccines, which is a serious issue, could well be said to fall within that definition.
I recognize that, and I think that's the reason for taking this topic seriously. The question of what power the state should have over the decision of parents. I mean, let's look at another thing that parents could do or decline to do that could have effects on their children, not only their children, but as a consequence of their children's behavior on society. And that's general antisocial pathological behavior that arises as a consequence of parents doing X, Y, or Z to their children. Now, one of the things that it's important to say about that is that it's very difficult to determine in advance as any parent knows, what specific actions have what specific consequences in children's behavior. And one of the things that's relevant there is there's individual difference at play, there's dynamics at play, there's accidents of where the family is situated in its local society and what effect that has on the difference between the kid's behavior and what other people expect and whether that has a negative consequence for others. Now, the question is, with respect to that domain of parental decision making, what would we say about a board empowered by a state entity at any level that has an enumerated best practices, and if parents don't do those things, then that board has the power to say, well, that constitutes neglect or whatnot, and we have the power to intervene. The point I'm making is simply that there are gray areas. Now, do I agree with you that there is such a thing as abuse and that the society at large has an interest in the individual child in addition to the parent's interest that may, in some cases, trump the parent's interest? I do think that I agree with that, although I look forward to thinking about that more. But I would recognize in another way of thinking about this is with respect to economic decisions. We have benefited, I'm sure you will agree, from a system of free enterprise, which essentially amounts to individuals using individual knowledge for individual purposes, and that redounding to the benefit of society. Agreed. I agree with you that I am not a free market fundamentalist by any means. But what I'm pointing out is that listeners would be able to recognize that that is a different ethos from one that says, we know what's best because we've decided on it as a matter of universal best practices. And if you don't do that, then we see fit to intervene. And
sure, but hold on for a second. The position that we have is that almost always the discretion of the parents is accepted, except for a tiny number of cases. That's the current position, and that has served us pretty well. So if somebody, for example, decides not to feed their child, there's going to be an intervention by the state. But and I don't want to harp on that too much. I think we have mentioned it. But to go to another issue that you mentioned, and you talked about Google, Amazon, and various others removing in various ways anti-vaccine propaganda or conspiracy theories from their services.
That's not the only thing that they've removed, but they have removed those things as well.
But hold on for a second.
There's a matter of collateral damage. So
there may well be, and collateral damage might be a good description of that, particularly because these are websites that have vast amounts of content which are not possible. It's not possible for them to be consistently reviewed by hand, so they're going to do it by machine, and there's going to be an error rate on that. And Correct. You said that this is censorship, and that's just not true. Amazon is not required to sell a book that it doesn't want to. And if Amazon takes the position that a book being sold on its platform is promoting untrue information, which is clearly harmful, then at a minimum, they're entitled to say, we're not going to carry that.
I agree that free speech is not the same as free reach. I agree that private entities have the right and the freedom to distribute what they would like to distribute. I don't know if I said in the article that it is censorship. I think at one point I raised the question that if the article I wrote, let me put it further.
They're under a moral duty not to allow their systems be used to propagate information which is untrue and harmful.
The question of what is or isn't true is never finally determined.
Yes, no, hold on, wait. Now we're getting to the center of the issue. That's true. Science knowledge is always provisional. It's our best knowledge so far, and it can be revised. But if you take the position that we don't do anything until we've gotten to the final truth, then you never do anything. We work with the best information we have.
I address that concern specifically in the article when I say, and I think I'll quote myself, I say, I affirm that we know something instead of nothing, and that therefore doing something instead of doing nothing is justified. I agree with that. In which case,
Amazon is justified in saying the best science available says that particular publications are untrue and harmful. We recognize that if we carry that information on our system, it is likely to be harmful to people. Therefore, we're not going to carry it. They have a moral duty to do that.
As we've already discussed, the question of what is or isn't the best science is not the total determinant of what should or shouldn't be discussed. Additionally, the word censorship may not be the best frame for this. The question is, to my mind, should an entity, or let me try and be precise. You say that the information, untrue information can be harmful. That's your claim. The question is, so we have what follows from that claim is a social engineering objective, which is there's something people should think to be true because we think it's true. And so what we're going to do is we're going to change the way we distribute information. I'm speaking as if I'm in an Amazon board meeting or something, so that we ensure that the population believe a certain thing, which we think if everybody believed that thing, the results would be better, rather than some people believing a thing which we think is a thing that if they do believe that, it will be harmful.
No. Your characterization is incorrect, because the we think in there is incorrect. It is the established science.
It is not incorrect,
not the we think. It's not the we think.
Well, maybe it's not only that, but it is that. It is that they think that. And additionally, they think it because they defer to the general peer review or what have you. So I dispute your claim that it's incorrect. It's just not sufficient. Now, when you say established science, there is this is an interesting conversation. Let me say that at this point. In my article, I don't do an extensive review of scientific claims, especially not ones that are beyond the pale or that make contra or that make claims that are unusual or that a lot of what happens in anti-scientific. Instead, almost every statistic that I cite or fact that I claim comes from a source that's widely available and widely reputed. There's no alternative facts here. There's no conspiracy theory in what obviously within the anti-vax movement, so to speak, in scare quotes, at large, there is a lot of that. I acknowledge that for sure. But in what I write, there isn't that. So my point in saying that at this point, in response to what you were saying, is to say that it's not a question of what the science is only. It's also a question of what reasoning about the science that we may agree on results in what decisions that we should make at the level of society and at the level of individuals. And to me, the thing that is of concern with the Amazons, banning books is not a good look. Full stop.
Amazon has no power to ban a book.
Okay. I take your point. Your point is Amazon is not the be-all, end-all. It's not a government enforcement, so therefore it's not censorship. I agree with that. But let's ask it the question in a different way. What should Amazon do? I think they should allow open inquiry. That's what I think.
Well, okay, I think we've reached a conclusion or clarified positions on that. And you said that you are not interested in promoting the scientific position, again in square quotes, of anti-vaxxers. But you say, and this is one quotation of a sentence here, it says, "It is certainly plausible that natural immunity from the, quotes, real illness has other points of advantage, so to speak, besides only lasting longer in comparison with vaccine-induced immunity." Well, that's plausible, but you're not saying which vaccine that you're talking about. And that seemed to me to be classic anti-vaxxer logic, that you throw out a statement of something could be true, and it could be true because you haven't bothered to read the scientific literature on that. When people develop vaccines, there is intensive investigation as to whether the administration of the vaccine delivers a better result than not delivering it.
One of the first things I say in the article is that I do not assert that vaccines, quote, don't work. I don't believe that. I do believe they do what they say they do. I do agree with you that they are thoroughly investigated, and I think there's a vast literature.
No, but you're saying it's plausible that, and then you repeat an anti-vax talking point. That's a plausible thing, but that has nothing. That has no backup. It is plausible that there lives a race of purple midgets under the surface of Pluto. But it's probably not true, and we don't believe it, not because it's plausible or implausible. We don't believe it because we don't have any evidence that it's the case. And without any evidence, it's just irresponsible to say that it is plausible that getting the disease is better than...
Plausible and possible are not the same thing. About the purple midgets, I would say... I wouldn't use the word plausible for that. I would say it doesn't follow from... in that
but you're making but the assertion is the comparison is exact. The comparison is exact because you're making a suggestion that something may be true without any evidence whatsoever.
Well, what I'm saying in that sentence that you quote is that the difference in outcome between lifelong immunity and immunity that requires a booster is one point of advantage between what I call in that sentence natural immunity, although I'm not very comfortable with that phrase necessarily, but anyway, so to speak. So in recognition of that single point of advantage, I state that it might be true that there are other points of advantage. And now, what you are saying is you deny that there are any other points.
It might be true that there are purple midgets under the surface of Pluto, but without evidence, neither of us are getting anywhere by making that claim.
Well, in one article, I don't claim that I have stated all the evidence, but I do address some other points of advantage at later points. For instance, there seems to be some evidence that contracting wild pertussis puts you at a lower risk for asthma. So that's another point of advantage, and that is documented by some research. So that's I don't know. I mean, but
that research is available. That research, and neither of us are doctors, but that research is available to anyone assessing the benefit and the cost-benefit analysis of giving a vaccine. And if I was getting on a plane and the guy beside me, several beers later, through his drool, said that this pilot didn't know how to fly the plane, he was a much better at flying the plane than the pilot. It might be true, but I can tell you, I want the pilot flying the plane. And somebody just idly speculating that the pilot might be wrong doesn't reassure me at all. I want the pilot flying the plane. And neither of us are qualified to assess the medical evidence, but we can look at the outcomes. And in the US, there have been minor outbreaks, for example, of measles, where there have been low uptakes of the measles vaccine. But there are other places that are ahead of that. And for example, in Romania and in Ukraine, there have been anti-vaccine campaigns that have been more virulent and more successful in depressing the vaccination rate. In the past 18 months, there are 40 children dead from measles in Romania, and a similar number in the Ukraine. And you don't need to be able to read or write scientific papers to count children's coffins, do you?
The answer to that question is no, I suppose.
And for years and years previously, there have been no deaths, zero deaths from measles.
You've said a lot. I wonder, as a question of priorities for the interview, what should be my way of responding? Should we go into the things you said individually? Because at the end you asked a question to which there was a simple answer, but is that what you want out of me, or do you want me to...
Clearly the question was rhetorical, but my point is that it's true, isn't it, that this is an exceptionally expert field. It's actually an awful lot more expert than pilots. You can train to be a pilot in about 2 or 3 years. To be an immunologist, it's at least 12 years. There's a huge amount of information there. Isn't it a bit narcissistic of the anti-vaxxers at a minimum, and maybe you're coming close to that line as well, to think that a bit of internet research can qualify you better than somebody who's spent years and years of their life studying a topic?
I will first note your use throughout this conversation of the words 1, narcissistic, 2, trite, 3, Dunning-Kruger effect, and just point out that one of the things I call for in the article is civility and the treatment of the perspectives of others with a matter of charity and care. Now, I understand that you're motivated by the fact that there are impacts to ideas, and having the right ideas can be effective towards goals that we all share. And so it's important to be forceful. So I just wanted to flag that. Now, another thing, you say that I think you used the phrase idly speculating. I think that anybody who reads the article would be hard pressed to assert of me that what I'm doing in the article is idle speculation. I think I do more than that. And
I wouldn't accuse you of that in the article in general, but in that particular case, that is pretty much idle speculation. And I'm not suggesting it's as malicious as that of anti-vaxxers, but saying there could well be other advantages to getting the disease and not having the vaccine.
But I did adduce at least one other example of that being the case, according to some research. Come on. That has been studied to death by people who know how to do that, and they've arrived at the conclusion that there's a dramatic advantage to having the vaccine and not the disease. Okay. So again, there are a lot of loose threads here, but the question of expertise is what you finished with at the end of the previous salvo, I might call it. I addressed that in the article, and the question is this: specialization is one of the conditions of expertise because of limited time in life and the fact that to be really good at something, you have to focus on it. And that's a good thing. We benefit from people's expertise, and I acknowledge expertise. The question is, though, when it comes to making decisions about something, as we've already discussed quite a bit, there's not a single frame of reference that suffices to completely determine what should be the answer to something. And as a consequence of that being true, there's not such a thing as an expert, a pan-expert, an expert universally on everything. We have experts about epidemiology, and they have studied what they study, and they know a lot. But they are not experts on policy, and they're not experts on individual difference or moral reasoning or what have you. So we have to have a conversation that involves all of those kinds of expertise. And also, you've brought up at certain times the not only expertise in itself, but also accreditation. You said, I think, we're not qualified, we're not doctors. Okay, but as I point out in the article, one upshot of that is that also means we don't have professional bias, and we also haven't been trained into a particular point of view. There can be advantages that come from having an outsider perspective, one. And two, the advantage of the generalist, Neil Postman has a phrase that's memorable, the specialist as ignoramus. And I don't assert that there's no such thing as expertise by any means. I think there is. But questions about what we should do as a society never come. There's no expert on that. It always is a question of, well, there's various things we have to trade off between them. And so I am not claiming to be an expert myself. What I'm claiming my arguments stand on their own, regardless of the source, regardless of my authority or non-authority. And so the question of which one of us is capable of, well, it doesn't matter. I mean, the question is the force.
I agree, Gautam. I agree with that point. Actually, I agree with that entirely. That the expert cannot make the moral decision. The expert who is expert in deciding how to do something cannot make the moral decision, cannot necessarily make the moral decision of whether it should be done. But the expert must be allowed to make the decision of if it's to be done, how it's to be done. That's where wider society, and you're right, people who have who are a generalist, who have broad training, who have perhaps a philosophical outlook, can absolutely make a decision, but it must be informed by the facts. And my criticism, above all else, of the anti-vax movement would be that they have fatally confused the morality and the facts of it. And they've essentially said, I believe it is right and moral that the sun should rise in the north. Therefore,
but is that
it must
what
be
I've
true.
said?
There are elements that I'm not going to accuse you of that wholesale, but I think there are elements of where you have, particularly where you say it's plausible that there are other advantages of having the real illness. People have studied that in great detail and have concluded that the health outcomes from getting the vaccine are drastically better than those for not getting the vaccine. And I'm not diminishing the role of the generalist or diminishing the role of the ought, but you cannot completely overthrow the facts with that.
Well, I don't do that. And we've already discussed this question of that line and the plausibility and what that might mean. I guess what I would say further is facts are not simply lying about in the world for you to go pick up and then, and once you do, they're there and they're true. It's always a question of it's not always a question of interpretation, but it is always a question of encountering the world with a motive. And, I think William Blake says that reason is the outer circumference of energy. And it's like there's something motivating your rationality and giving it substance. Now, that's not to say that what outer circumference means something. It means that it strikes down certain things that you're motivated to do as things you shouldn't do. That's true. But I guess what I just want to point out is that there's a vast landscape of facts, all of which may be true. And yet there can be different motivations to select among them to make a case or to rationalize certain things or to reason in a certain way. And so when you say, isn't there, once we decide what we should do, isn't there a clear set of facts that are brought to bear on it? Well, there are many such sets of facts. Some of which are facts of ethical reasoning, some of which are facts of epidemiology, some of which are facts about the results of applying a principle of healthcare universally, despite differences in individuals, et cetera, et cetera. I think that you are advocating that there is a consensus, and the consensus is arrived at by a robust scientific process, and to deny that or to not consider that to be relevant is some kind of a dereliction, and it's dangerous. And what I would say to that is there's always a role for people to question that consensus, and that questioning is essentially what science is. And just taking, that something has been determined by that process, and it's as if, okay, we're done with that. I don't know. I guess what I would say about that in this case, with respect to this topic, is why don't people read what I wrote and see if it contains anything they haven't seen before? And
we'll link to it in the show notes then, Gautam Tejas Ganeshan. Thank you very much for talking to me.
All right. Thank you. I appreciated the interview, and I think your curiosity and your thinking are valuable.
Never miss a show. You can subscribe to the podcast for free using iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, or any other podcast software or app. See challengingopinions.com/subscribe for details.
Go to the website for sources and links to what we were talking about. And while you're there, please like the show on Facebook, follow @ChallengingO on Twitter, and get in touch with me if you can suggest a guest or a topic for a future show. And thanks to everyone who's signed up as a patron on Patreon so far. I really appreciate you. It means I can devote more time to research and finding interesting guests. And if you could do the same as them and donate $1 or $2 per podcast or per month, you will find a link on the website. Also, you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. It's all at www.challengingopinions.com. Coming up next Monday, that's August 12th, I'll be talking to the writer and journalist Rhys Ehrlich about his latest book on Iran. The Challenging Opinions podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. Thank you for listening.